Remember when dinner meant something you couldn't just microwave? Back in the 1970s, folks in the hills were still cooking meals their grandparents would recognize. Dishes with names like leather britches and burgoo. Food that came from the garden, the woods, and pure necessity. Most of these recipes have vanished completely, but the memories still linger for those who grew up with them. Let's take you back to 25 hillbilly dinners that defined mountain cooking before everything changed. Corn pone. Corn pone was the bread of the hills, and it had nothing to do with what you find in stores today. This was survival bread, made when wheat flour cost money families didn't have. You'd take coarse cornmeal, the kind that still had some grit to it, and add just enough buttermilk or water to hold it together. A pinch of salt went in, and maybe a spoonful of bacon grease if you were lucky enough to have some. Then you'd pat it into flat cakes with your hands and cook them in a cast iron skillet over fire or on a hot stone. The outside got crispy and golden brown, crackling when you bit into it. The inside stayed dense and filling, with that slightly gritty texture that satisfied hunger like nothing else could. One piece could hold you for hours of hard farm work. Women took real pride in their corn pone recipe. You could tell a good cook by whether her corn pone held together without crumbling and whether it had that perfect balance of crisp outside and moist inside. A woman's reputation in the community often rested on things like this. The stuff they call cornbread now is too sweet, too soft, too cake-like. Real corn pone had substance to it. It was meant to fill you up and keep you going, not to be dessert. Some families made it 3 times a day because it was cheap, filling, and used ingredients they could grow themselves. No running to the store for fancy wheat flour that cost precious cash money. Hominy. Hominy looked strange if you'd never seen it before. These swollen white kernels that barely resembled corn anymore, almost alien-looking. But mountain families learned to make it from their Cherokee neighbors back in the 1800s, and they kept making it because it worked and it was nutritious. The process wasn't simple. You'd take dried field corn and soak in live water made from hardwood ashes for days, sometimes up to a week. The caustic solution would loosen those tough outer hulls that made regular dried corn so hard to digest. Women would stir it with wooden paddles in large iron pots. Check it every day to see if the hulls were ready to slip off. After days of soaking, you'd rinse it over and over in fresh spring water until every trace of the lye was gone. The kernels would emerge completely transformed, doubled in size, ghostly white, and tender enough to chew without breaking a tooth. The finished hominy could be boiled into a hearty porridge that stuck to your ribs, fried crispy in pork fat until it had a golden crust, or even dried again for winter storage when fresh food was impossible to come by. The flavor was different from regular corn, deeper somehow, with a subtle earthiness that came from that long processing. You can buy canned hominy at the store now, sitting right there on the shelf next to the regular corn. But it tastes nothing like the homemade kind that took 3 days to prepare properly. The texture is too soft, the flavor too bland. Real hominy had character to it. Pickled pig's feet and cornbread. When families butchered their yearly hog, usually in late fall, when the weather turned cold enough to keep meat from spoiling, nothing went to waste. Every part of that animal had a purpose, including the feet that became a treasured delicacy through the ancient art of pickling. This wasn't desperation food or something you ate because you had no choice. Properly prepared pickled pig's feet were considered a treat that graced special occasion tables and provided protein-rich sustenance through long winters when fresh meat was impossible to come by. The preparation began immediately after butchering while everything was fresh and clean. The pig's feet were thoroughly scrubbed to remove any dirt, then boiled in a big pot until the meat was tender and the skin became gelatinous and silky. This could take several hours of slow simmering. Meanwhile, you'd prepare the pickling liquid. Hot vinegar seasoned with bay leaves, black peppercorns, red pepper flakes for heat, and salt. Some families added garlic cloves or mustard seed for extra flavor. Once the feet were cooked and still hot, they'd be packed into stone crocks or glass jars, and that hot spice vinegar would be poured over them until they were completely covered. Then you'd seal them up and let them cure in a cool place for weeks. The vinegar would penetrate the meat and transform it. After proper curing, the pig's feet emerged completely changed. The meat would fall off the bone at the slightest touch. The The skin became silky and flavorful instead of tough, and everything was permeated with that tangy, spiced vinegar. They were served cold, pulled straight from the jar, with fresh cornbread to soak up the flavorful pickling liquid. This dish provided essential protein and made every part of that precious hog last through winter when fresh meat was scarce. The gelatin-rich broth was considered especially nourishing for pregnant women and growing children who needed extra nutrition. Possum and sweet potatoes. Now, possum might make you turn your nose up today, but in mountain communities, it was considered special occasion food, not something you ate every day. This was Sunday dinner material, the kind of meal you served when the preacher came by, or when you wanted to impress somebody. Wild possums that had been eating persimmons and acorns in late fall actually had sweet-tasting meat. Nothing like what you'd expect. The diet made all the difference. A possum that had been eating garbage would taste terrible, but one that had been feeding on wild fruit and nuts was something else entirely. The preparation was involved, which is part of what made it special. After catching and cleaning the animal, you'd scrub it thoroughly and soak it overnight in salt water to draw out any remaining wild flavor. The next day, you'd parboil it, which meant boiling it briefly before the real cooking started. This step was crucial for getting rid of that last bit of gaminess. Then came the stuffing. You'd fill the body cavity with sweet potatoes, wild onions, and fresh sage from the garden. Some cooks added apples if they had them. The whole animal would then be roasted slowly in a Dutch oven that was buried in coals, basting it frequently with its own fat mixed with molasses. This could take hours, but the result was worth it. The meat would become fall-apart tender. The skin would crisp up beautifully with a deep golden color, and those sweet potatoes inside would absorb all those rich meat juices and become almost candy-like. Served with cornbread to soak up the drippings and greens from the garden, this was what passed for fine dining in the hills. City folks who actually tried it, who got past their preconceptions, were usually surprised by how good it tasted. The meat was mild, slightly sweet, and nothing like the tough game meat they expected. Turtle soup with cornbread. Mountain streams and ponds provided more than just water for washing and drinking. They offered protein in the form of snapping turtles that could weigh 20 pounds or more, prehistoric-looking creatures with powerful jaws. This wasn't backwoods desperation food either. Turtle soup was considered a genuine delicacy that rivaled anything served in fancy city hotels. People who'd eaten in expensive restaurants would tell you that turtle soup was one of the finest dishes you could have. Catching snapping turtles required real courage and skill, because these creatures could snap off fingers with their powerful jaws. You didn't just wade in and grab one. You had to be smart about it, using long sticks or special techniques that kept your hands away from those jaws. Once caught, the turtle was cleaned and the meat removed from the shell, revealing surprisingly tender flesh that tasted like a cross between chicken and fish, with a texture all its own. The preparation was elaborate, befitting its special status as company food. You'd cut the turtle meat into chunks and slowly simmer it with wild onions, herbs from the garden, and root vegetables until it fell apart. Some cooks added hard-boiled eggs for richness and a splash of vinegar for tang, which brightened all the flavors. The finished soup was thick and deeply flavorful, almost rich enough to be a stew. You'd serve it alongside fresh cornbread to soak up every precious drop of that broth. Turtle soup was reserved for special occasions and honored guests, not everyday eating. It proved that mountain cuisine could rival any city restaurant when ingredients and skill combined. The work involved and the size of the turtles meant you didn't make this casually. Groundhog Stew. Groundhogs weren't just for predicting weather on February 2nd. In the hills, they were legitimate food, especially in late winter when the meat supplies from fall butchering were running dangerously low. These plump, slow-moving rodents came out of hibernation in February, and they'd spent months building up fat reserves, which made the meat surprisingly tender and flavorful. Nothing like what you'd expect from something that lived in a hole in the ground. Hunting them required patience and a good eye, because they were cautious animals. But when you got one, you had several pounds of meat that could feed the family for days. The preparation was important. You'd skin and clean it, then cut the meat into chunks and soak it overnight in salt water to remove any wild gaminess. That soaking made all the difference between meat that tasted wild and meat that tasted good. The next day, you'd brown those chunks in pork fat until they had a nice color on them. Then you cover with water. Add whatever root vegetables the family had stored through winter. Typically potatoes, carrots, and turnips, along with wild onions, if you could find them. The whole pot would simmer for hours over wood fire, low and slow, until the meat fell right off the bone and the broth turned rich and golden with all that fat rendering out. The vegetables would soak up the flavor and become almost sweet. One groundhog could stretch to feed a family of 6 for several days if you were careful about portions. These days, people think of groundhogs as nothing but pests that dig up their gardens. But back then, they were legitimate protein when other meat was scarce and expensive. Squirrel and dumplings. Squirrels were everywhere in the mountains, in every hollow and on every ridge. That abundance made them reliable protein when other meat ran low or when you needed to feed unexpected company that showed up at dinner time. Squirrel hunting was a rite of passage for mountain boys, often their first experience with real hunting. And preparing squirrel and dumplings was considered essential knowledge for mountain wives. If you couldn't make a proper pot of squirrel and dumplings, people wondered what your mama had taught you. The process began with cleaning and joining 2 or 3 squirrels, depending on how many mouths you needed to feed. You'd brown the pieces in bacon grease until they got golden and developed some color. Then you cover the meat with water, add wild onions and whatever herbs you had growing, and let it simmer for a good long, while until the meat was tender enough to fall off the bone. While that was cooking, you'd make the dumplings. The dough was simple: flour, salt, and enough water or milk to form a stiff dough that you could roll out thin on a floured board. You'd cut it into strips about 2 inches wide and 3 or 4 inches long. When the squirrel was tender, you'd drop these dumplings into the bubbling broth one at a time, making sure they didn't stick together. They'd puff up as they cooked and absorb all that rich, gamey flavor from the meat. After about 15 minutes, you'd have tender meat swimming in thick, dumpling-studded gravy that tasted like pure comfort. The dumplings would be slippery and soft, flavored all the way through with that squirrel broth. One pot could feed a family for 2 meals, making it economical as well as delicious. Some families ate this once a week during fall and winter when squirrels were plentiful. Rabbit fricassee. Wild rabbits provided year-round protein for mountain families because they bred prolifically and were everywhere. But rabbit fricassee turned the small game into an elegant dish that graced Sunday tables and special occasions. This wasn't simple fried rabbit where you just threw it in a skillet. Fricassee required finesse and patience, a gentle cooking method that transformed tough wild rabbit into forked tender meat swimming in rich, creamy gravy. The process began with joining young rabbits into pieces and soaking them in salt water to remove any gamey taste that wild meat sometimes carried. After soaking for a few hours, you dry the pieces and dredge them in seasoned flour, getting a good coating on all sides. Then you brown them slowly in bacon grease until they were golden, taking your time so the meat developed good color without burning. After browning, the magic really started. You cover the brown meat with water or milk, add wild onions and herbs, and let it simmer gently for over an hour until the meat practically fell off the bone. The key was keeping the heat low, so the meat stayed tender instead of getting tough. As it cooked, the flour coating would dissolve into the liquid and thicken it naturally. Toward the end, you'd add more flour mixed with liquid to create a velvety gravy that coated the tender rabbit pieces. Some mountain cooks added wild mushrooms they foraged or early spring greens to stretch the dish further and add color. The finished fricassee was served over biscuits or cornbread, turning one small rabbit into a meal fit for company. This dish proved that mountain cooking could be as refined as any city cuisine when someone took the time to do it right. The gravy alone was worth making, rich and savory, with all those brown bits from the meat. Pork ribs with sauerkraut. German immigrants who settled in mountain regions during the 1700s and 1800s brought their sauerkraut-making skills, which perfectly complemented the abundant wild hogs that roamed Appalachian forests. This combination created a dish that was both exotic and completely mountain at the same time, old world technique meeting new world ingredients. Wild hogs were descendants of escaped domestic pigs that had gone feral and multiplied in the forests. These animals provided free-range pork with more flavor than any store-bought variety, though they were intelligent and dangerous to hunt. Mountain hunters tracked these animals through dense forests and successful hunts provided families with fresh pork that needed to be preserved quickly before it spoiled. Meanwhile, mountain garden produced cabbage that could be fermented into tangy sauerkraut using ancient German techniques that had been adapted to mountain conditions. The cabbage would be shredded, salted, and packed into crocks where it would ferment for weeks, developing that distinctive sour flavor and preserving the vegetable for winter use. When it came time to cook, the ribs were cut from fresh-killed hogs and slowly braised with a homemade sauerkraut in a big pot or Dutch oven. The cooking process took hours, with the meat becoming so tender it would fall off the bone while the sauerkraut mellowed and absorbed all those rich, fatty pork flavors. The tangy fermented cabbage balanced the rich, fatty pork perfectly, cutting through the grease and refreshing your palate with every bite. This wasn't a dish you'd throw together on a weeknight. It was special occasion food that represented the cultural mixing that made mountain cuisine unique. Old world techniques applied to new world ingredients, creating something entirely American yet tied to ancient traditions that went back centuries in Europe. Burgoo. This wasn't soup. It was liquid community, a massive stew that could feed hundreds and turn any gathering into a celebration. Burgoo originated as a way to use whatever meat and vegetables were available, creating a dish that was different every single time, but always satisfying. No two pots of burgoo were ever exactly alike. Traditional burgoo required a community effort, with neighbors contributing ingredients and taking turns stirring the massive pot that could hold 20 gallons or more. These weren't small kitchen pots. They were enormous kettles that required several men to move when full. The base usually started with whatever meat was available and plenty of it: rabbit, squirrel, chicken, beef, pork, or even wild game like deer or bear. Some burgoos had 5 or 6 different kinds of meat going into the pot. Vegetables were added according to season and whatever people brought: corn, lima beans, tomatoes, okra, potatoes, onions, whatever was in season and available. The key was slow cooking over wood fires with designated stirrers, taking shifts to prevent sticking and ensure even cooking. You couldn't just set it and forget it. Someone had to stir that pot constantly, or the bottom would scorch and ruin a whole batch. After 6 or 8 hours of simmering, the ingredients would melt into a thick, rich stew where you could barely tell where one ingredient ended and another began. It was served with cornbread and became the centerpiece of church gatherings, political rallies, and community celebrations. Each family's burgoo was slightly different, reflecting their available ingredients and cooking traditions. Some were tomato-based and reddish. Others were brown and gravy-like. But all of them represented mountain resourcefulness and community spirit coming together in one pot. Ramp dinner. Few foods could divide a mountain community quite like ramps, those wild leeks that grew in shaded hollows and possessed an odor so powerful they could clear a room. Yet ramp dinners were among the most celebrated community events in Appalachian culture, marking spring's arrival with pungent festivities that lasted for days and left everyone smelling the same. Ramps looked innocent enough when you first dug them up. Slender green shoots with broad leaves and small white bulbs. They resembled green onions or baby leeks. But their onion garlic flavor was so intense, so overpowering. It could be detected on someone's breath and come into their skin for a week after eating. Some people loved this intensity. Others couldn't stand it. But everyone agreed that ramps meant spring had truly arrived. Mountain families organized ramp dinners as community celebrations. Entire hollows would gather to cook and consume vast quantities of these wild leeks in what became a kind of communal stink fest. The preparation was simple because ramps didn't need much help. They were cleaned thoroughly to remove any dirt, then fried with eggs, mixed with bacon or potatoes, or even eaten raw with cornbread and beans. The social aspect was as important as the nutritional. Ramp dinners were an excuse for neighbors to gather after a long winter of isolation, share news and gossip, and strengthen community bonds that would carry through the year. Children were often excused from school the day after ramp dinners because the smell was so overwhelming in classrooms. Teachers couldn't handle having 30 kids in one room who'd all eaten ramps the night before. These pungent celebrations proved that mountain food was about more than just survival or nutrition. It was about community, tradition, and embracing whatever the mountains provided, even if it made you smell like you bathed in garlic oil for a week. Mess of wild greens. Spring's arrival in the mountains wasn't announced by calendars hanging on the wall. It was announced by the emergence of wild greens that could save families from scurvy and add desperately needed fresh vitamins to winter-weary bodies. This wasn't casual salad gathering for fun. It was serious foraging that required extensive knowledge of what was safe to eat and what could kill you dead. One wrong plant could be your last meal. Mountain women passed down identification skills through generations, teaching daughters to recognize pokeweed, lamb's quarters, wild spinach, dandelion greens, dock, and dozens of other edible plants. This knowledge was as valuable as knowing how to cook or preserve food. The gathering expedition was a social event in early spring. Women and children would spread across hillsides with baskets, collecting enough greens for immediate eating and drying for later use. You had to know when each plant was at its prime. Too early, and they wouldn't have grown enough to bother with. Too late, and they'd be tough and bitter. The preparation was simple but crucial for safety and taste. Most wild greens were boiled twice in separate pots of water to remove bitterness and potential toxins that could make you sick. Pokeweed especially needed this treatment because the raw plant contains compounds that can be harmful after the double boiling. The greens would be drained and then sautéed with bacon grease or fatback for flavor. Some cooks added a splash of vinegar to brighten things up. The finished mess of greens was piled high on plates, dark green and glistening with fat. They provided essential nutrients that had been missing from winter diets of preserved meat and stored grains. People actually craved them after months of eating the same stored foods. This dish represented the deep connection between mountain families and their environment, proving that survival required intimate knowledge of the natural world around you. Corn silk tea. While city folks threw away corn husks and silk as waste, mountain families knew these supposedly useless scraps held powerful medicine that could treat everything from kidney problems to high blood pressure. This wasn't superstition or old wives' tales either. Modern science has actually confirmed that corn silk contains compounds with genuine therapeutic properties. The old folks knew what they were talking about. During corn season, mountain women carefully saved the silky threads that protected each ear of corn. Instead of tossing them aside or feeding them to animals, they'd spread those golden threads on screens to dry in the sun. The silk had to be completely dry before storage or would mold and become useless. Once dried, it was stored in glass jars or cloth bags, ready to be brewed into healing tea throughout the year. Even in the dead of winter, when fresh corn was just a memory, the preparation was simple, which made it accessible even when you were feeling poorly. You take a handful of dried corn silk and steep it in boiling water for about 10 minutes, just like making regular tea. The water would turn a pale golden color and develop a mild, slightly sweet flavor that wasn't unpleasant to drink. Mountain healers prescribed corn silk tea for urinary troubles, swelling in the legs and feet, and various women's problems that weren't discussed openly. Many families drank it regularly as a general health tonic, believing it prevented problems before they started. The tea was considered safe enough for children and pregnant women, making it a go-to remedy when other medicines weren't available or couldn't be used. Doctors were expensive and far away, so families relied on remedies like this that they could make themselves. This humble beverage represented the mountain philosophy of wasting nothing and using everything. Even the corn silk that looked like worthless hair had value for those who knew its secrets. Leather breeches. Don't let the name fool you. These weren't pants or any kind of clothing. Leather breeches were green beans transformed into leathery strips that could hang from the rafters all winter long, providing vegetables when gardens lay buried under snow. This preservation method turned summer's abundance into winter sustenance without requiring expensive canning equipment or precious salt that cost money. The process began during peak bean season when mountain gardens produced more fresh beans than families could possibly eat. You had to strike while the iron was hot, because beans only produced for a limited time. Young, tender green beans, preferably the Kentucky Wonder variety that grew long and straight, were strung on heavy thread using a large needle. You'd poke the needle through each bean, creating long garlands that looked like green necklaces. These bean strings were hung from kitchen rafters, porch ceilings, or attic beams, anywhere air could circulate freely around them. Over several weeks, as they hung there above daily life, the beans would slowly dry into brown, wrinkled strips that rattled like leather when you touched them. That's where the name came from. They genuinely felt like thin strips of leather. Come winter, When snow covered everything and fresh vegetables were just a memory, you'd pull down handfuls of these dried beans. They'd need to soak overnight in water to rehydrate and soften. The next day, you cook them slowly with fatback or bacon until they were tender again, which could take a couple hours. The finished beans had a concentrated, slightly smoky flavor that fresh beans couldn't match. Some people actually preferred them to fresh beans because that drying and slow cooking process developed such deep flavor. This ancient preservation method kept families fed with vegetables long after gardens had died back for winter. Fatback, before refrigeration made fresh meat available year-round. Fatback was the bacon that never went bad. This was pure pork fat from the pig's back. Thick slabs that could be cured with salt and stored for months without spoiling. It wasn't the streaky bacon we know today, with alternating fat and meat. Fatback was solid fat, and it served as both seasoning and survival food for mountain families who depended on it to add flavor and essential calories to otherwise bland foods. When you butchered that yearly hog, the thick layer of fat from the back was carefully removed in large pieces. These slabs would be rubbed thoroughly with coarse salt and stacked in barrels or crocks where they cure for weeks. The salt drew out moisture and preserved the fat, so it could last through winter and into spring. Mountain families depended on fatback for daily cooking. Sliced thin, it would be fried slowly in a cast iron skillet until it rendered into crispy cracklings swimming in pure, snowy white lard. Both the cracklings and the rendered fat were culinary gold in mountain kitchens. The cracklings added crunch and intense porky flavor to cornbread, turning plain bread into something special. The lard was carefully saved in jars or cans and used for cooking everything from vegetables to desserts. A small piece of fatback could transform a pot of beans or greens from simple subsistence food into something approaching luxury. The fat provided essential calories that helped mountain families survive harsh winters when fresh food was scarce and people were burning thousands of calories daily just to stay warm and get work done. Fatback was also portable protein that could be carried on hunting trips or work expeditions. You could slip a piece in your pocket and have ready energy and flavor when you needed it most. Modern people might turn their noses up at eating pure pork fat, but in those days, it was precious fuel. Soup, beans, and cornbread. This wasn't just a meal. It was a foundation of mountain survival, a perfect protein combination that could sustain families through the leanest times when meat was scarce or non-existent. The magic happened when dried beans and cornmeal joined forces, creating a complete protein that rivaled expensive meat in nutritional value. Scientists know now that beans and corn together provide all the amino acids a human body needs, but mountain families figured this out through experience long before anyone understood the science. Mountain families grew their own beans, usually tough varieties like pintos or October beans that could withstand harsh weather, poor soil, and still produce a decent crop. These beans were left on the vine until completely dry, then shelled and stored in cloth bags or jars for winter. The preparation was simple, but required patience. You'd sort through dried beans to remove any rocks or bad beans, then soak them overnight in water, so they'd cook faster and more evenly. The next morning, you'd drain them, put them in a pot, cover them with fresh water, and add a piece of fatback or ham hock for flavor. Then came hours of slow cooking over wood fire, checking occasionally to make sure they didn't dry out or burn. Too little water, and the beans would stick to the bottom. Too much, and you'd have watery soup instead of creamy beans. The perfect pot of beans had enough liquid to be soupy, but the beans themselves would be tender and creamy inside, with some bursting open to thicken the pot liquor. Meanwhile, cornbread was mixed fresh using stone-ground cornmeal, buttermilk, and a touch of bacon grease. The batter was poured into a preheated cast iron skillet that had been greased and heated until the fat was smoking hot. The bread would bake until the bottom formed a crackling crust and the top turned golden. Together, beans and cornbread provided everything the human body needed to thrive. This combination was the backbone of Appalachian cuisine, and the reason mountain families could survive in isolation for generations without regular access to stores or outside food. Corn chowder. When sweet corn season peaked in late summer, mountain families turned surplus ears into rich, creamy chowder that could feed a crowd and celebrate the harvest bounty. This wasn't thin corn soup where you could see through to the bottom of the bowl. It was thick, substantial chowder that could serve as a complete meal when accompanied by fresh biscuits or cornbread. The dish made the most of corn season's brief abundance. The preparation began with cutting fresh corn kernels off the cob, but experienced cooks knew the real flavor came from what happened next. After cutting off the kernels, you take the back of your knife and scrape down each cob to extract the sweet, milky liquid hiding inside. This corn milk was pure gold, packed with starch and sweetness that would naturally thicken the chowder without needing flour or other thickeners. The corn and its milk were combined with diced potatoes, wild onions, and sometimes salt pork or bacon for richness and depth. Everything went into a big pot with water or milk and simmered slowly. As it cooked, the potatoes would start to break down and the corn would release its starch, creating a naturally thick, creamy texture. Some mountain cooks added fresh milk or cream when it was available, usually in summer when cows were producing well. But the dish was designed to be delicious even when dairy products were scarce or non-existent. After about an hour of simmering, you'd have a chowder that was sweet, savory, and completely satisfying. The corn would still have some texture, the potatoes would be tender, and the whole thing would have a silky consistency that coated your spoon. This was summer sunshine in a bowl, sweet corn at its absolute peak, transformed into something that could warm the soul even as autumn chills began creeping into the mountains. Apple stack cake. This wasn't your regular layer cake that you'd make for a birthday. Apple stack cake was a community project, a testament to cooperation and mountain ingenuity. You saw these mostly at weddings, where they became the centerpiece of the whole celebration. The tradition worked like this. Each wedding guest would bring a thin cake layer, and the bride's family provided a filling made from dried apples that had been cooked down with molasses, cinnamon, and sometimes a splash of moonshine, if someone had it available. The more layers the cake had, the more popular the couple was, because it meant more people had come to celebrate with them. 6 layers was respectable. 8 or 10 meant you had a lot of friends and family. You'd stack these layers high, spreading that thick, sticky apple mixture between each one. The filling acted as both flavor and mortar, holding the whole construction together. Then you'd wrap the entire cake in clean cloth and let it sit for days, sometimes up to a week. During that time, something magical happened. The flavors melded together, the layers softened as they absorbed moisture from the apple filling, and the whole thing transformed into something greater than its parts. The finished cake looked like a small mountain, which seemed appropriate. When you cut into it, the layers had almost merged together, and it tasted like concentrated autumn. Every bite had that deep apple flavor, the warmth of cinnamon and molasses, and the satisfying density of real cake. It could feed 50 people easily, with slices to spare. Sugar was expensive in the mountains, hard to come by, so this cake relied on dried apples and molasses for sweetness instead of fancy frosting made with white sugar and butter. Persimmon bread. When the first frost sweetened wild persimmons hanging from mountain trees, families knew it was time to gather these orange globes for one of the mountain's most treasured desserts. Persimmon bread wasn't just a seasonal treat. It was autumn concentrated into loaf form, capturing the essence of mountain fall in every slice. Wild persimmons were smaller and more intensely flavored than the cultivated varieties you might find in stores. They had a sweetness that was almost tropical but balanced by subtle astringency that made your mouth pucker if you ate them before they were fully ripe. Gathering persimmons was a family activity with children climbing trees to shake the branches while adults caught the ripe fruit in sheets spread below on the ground. Timing was everything. The persimmons had to be perfectly ripe, soft to the touch and almost jelly-like inside. Too early, and they'd make your mouth pucker so badly you couldn't talk. Too late, and they'd be mushy and fermented. The fruit was pressed through sieve to create smooth pulp, removing the large seeds and any skin. This pulp formed the base of the bread. Mixed with flour, sugar when available, eggs, and warm spices like cinnamon and nutmeg, the persimmon pulp created a dense, moist bread that tasted like autumn itself. Sweet, spicy, and complex with flavors you couldn't quite identify but recognized as distinctly fall. The finished loaves came out of the oven dark orange with a texture somewhere between banana bread and pound cake. They were dense and moist, never dry or crumbly. Persimmon bread could be stored for weeks, improving with age as the flavors melded and deepened. Some families made enough to last through Christmas, wrapping loaves in cloth and storing them in cool places where they'd stay moist and delicious for months. Mock apple pie, the pie that fooled everyone, made with crackers instead of apples, yet tasted exactly like the real thing. During the Great Depression and World War II rationing, when fresh fruit was scarce and expensive, this ingenious dessert proved that American creativity knew no bounds. Ritz crackers, of all things, became the secret ingredient that somehow transformed into tender, spiced apples that could fool even the most discerning palate. It seemed impossible, but it worked. The alchemy was pure kitchen magic that still seems unbelievable. You'd crush Ritz crackers into chunks, not crumbs, and layer them in a pie crust. Then came the genius part, creating a syrup from water, sugar, cream of tartar, and lemon juice. This exact combination somehow mimicked apple's natural acids and sugars. You'd pour this syrup over crackers along with cinnamon and nutmeg, the same spices you'd use in a real apple pie. As it baked, something remarkable happened. The crackers would absorb the spice syrup, swelling and softening into something that had the exact texture and flavor of cooked apples. The cream of tartar provided tartness, the lemon juice added brightness, and the crackers themselves contributed a tender texture that was eerily similar to apple slices. People would take a bite and swear they were eating real apples. This pie represented wartime ingenuity at its finest. Families could serve traditional American dessert when apple orchards were bare and grocery store fruit was beyond financial reach, or simply unavailable due to rationing. It became a symbol of making do with what you had, of refusing to let hard times rob you of simple pleasures like dessert. Ritz even printed the recipe on their cracker boxes, making it official. Today's apple pies, despite using real fruit, rarely match the nostalgic satisfaction of this clever Depression-era deception that turned saltine crackers into fruit. Cream corn on toast, before fancy brunches and avocado toast. This simple dish proved that comfort food didn't need complexity to satisfy completely. During the Great Depression and war years, cream corn on toast became the answer to what's for dinner when pantries were nearly bare and paychecks didn't stretch far enough. A can of corn, some milk, flour, and day-old bread transformed into a meal that was surprisingly filling and satisfying, proving that simple ingredients could create real comfort when prepared with care. The preparation was pure comfort food simplicity that anyone could manage. You'd start by making a basic white sauce, melting butter in a pan, whisking in flour until it was smooth, then slowly adding milk while stirring constantly to prevent lumps. The sauce would thicken as it heated, becoming smooth and velvety. Then you'd stir in corn kernels, either from a can if you had one, or cut fresh from the cob if it was summer. Season it with salt, pepper, and sometimes a touch of sugar to enhance the corn's natural sweetness. The mixture would bubble and thicken, becoming rich and creamy. Meanwhile, you'd toast thick slices of bread, preferably day-old bread that had dried out a bit, and could soak up the creamy corn without falling apart immediately. Pour that hot, creamy corn over the toast, and you had a meal. This wasn't just cheap food that people ate begrudgingly. It was genuine comfort that could soothe both body and spirit during difficult times. Children actually looked forward to cream corn nights, and adults found real satisfaction in this humble combination. The dish represented American resourcefulness at its core, taking basic pantry staples and creating something that felt indulgent and special, proving that luxury was more about preparation and care than price tags or fancy ingredients. Corn dodgers. These weren't bread rolls you'd serve at a fancy dinner. Corn dodgers were portable survival food that could keep a mountain man fed for days on the trail without spoiling. They earned their name during the Civil War, when soldiers supposedly dodged bullets while eating them, though mountain families had been making them long before any war came through. The recipe was brutally simple, which was the whole point. You'd take coarse cornmeal and mix it with just enough water to form a stiff dough that could be shaped by hand. Some cooks added a pinch of salt or a spoonful of bacon grease for flavor, but purists made them with nothing but meal and water. The dough had to be stiff enough to hold its shape without falling apart. You'd form them into small cakes or patties, then bake them on hot stones around the fire or fry them in a skillet until they developed a hard golden crust. That crust was important because it protected the dense interior and kept the dodgers from going bad. These weren't meant to be eaten fresh out of the skillet, though you could. Corn dodgers were designed to be carried in a pocket or pack, where they'd keep for weeks without spoiling, even in summer heat. When hunger struck on the trail or during a long day in the fields, you pull one out and gnaw on it like hardtack, letting your saliva slowly soften the rock-hard exterior. They tasted like concentrated corn and determination, not fancy, but effective. Hunters carried them, travelers relied on them, and families made batches to have on hand for emergencies. They weren't pretty or refined, but they kept people alive when nothing else was available. Hoover Stew. This bitterly named dish became America's reluctant lifeline during the Great Depression's darkest days. Named mockingly after President Herbert Hoover, who many blamed for the economic collapse. This stew was born from empty pantries and broken promises. Families across rural America threw together whatever scraps they could find, creating sustenance that was equal parts meal and social commentary. The name itself was an insult turned into daily reality. The preparation was creative desperation at its finest. You'd start with diced potatoes and onions if you had them. These were the base because they were cheap and filling. Then you'd add any vegetables you could scrape together. Turnips, carrots, cabbage, even dandelion greens pulled from the yard. The meat situation was grim. You might have bacon fat to flavor the pot, a ham bone that had already been boiled twice before, or cheap cuts if you were lucky enough to have any money at all. Everything would simmer in water with salt, pepper, and whatever wild herbs could find. The result was thin, watery stew that somehow filled bellies and lifted spirits despite having almost nothing in it. This became the great equalizer during America's economic crisis. Rich families who'd lost everything in the stock market crash found themselves eating the same thin stew alongside poor neighbors who never had much to begin with. Children learned not to complain about food because everyone knew how lucky you were to have anything on the table. Hoover Stew represented both survival and bitter disappointment, proof that Americans could make it through anything while also remembering who they blamed for their suffering. The name stuck as a reminder that even presidents couldn't escape the consequences of economic disaster. Fried catfish and hushpuppies. Mountain streams provided more than just cool water for drinking. They were home to whiskered catfish that became the centerpiece of legendary fish fries that brought entire communities together. These weren't delicate trout fishing expeditions where you stood in waders with fancy flies. Catching catfish required patience, strong hands, and sometimes the courage to reach into dark holes where big cats lurked, a practice called noodling that could be dangerous. Fresh-caught catfish were cleaned and skinned on the bank, revealing firm white meat that was surprisingly sweet and mild despite the fish's muddy reputation. The fillets would be soaked in buttermilk for an hour or so to remove any earthy taste, though really fresh catfish from clear streams didn't need much help. Then they'd be dredged in seasoned cornmeal, sometimes mixed with a bit of flour, that created a golden crunchy coating when fried in hot lard. The coating had to be just right, thick enough to protect the fish, but not so thick it overwhelmed the delicate meat. Alongside the fish came Hushpuppies, those legendary cornmeal fritters that were as much a part of fish fries as the fish itself. You'd mix cornmeal with chopped onions, a bit of flour, and buttermilk to make a thick batter, then drop spoonfuls into the same hot fat where the fish had cooked. They'd puff up and turn golden brown, crispy outside and tender inside. Legend says Hush Puppies got their name from cooks who tossed them to barking dogs with the command, "Hush, puppies," to keep them quiet during outdoor fish fries. The combination of crispy outside, flaky inside catfish with hot, slightly sweet Hush Puppies created a meal that satisfied both body and soul. These fish fries were social events where neighbors gathered, shared food, and strengthened community bonds over plates piled high with fried fish. Scrapple, the ultimate waste-not, want-not dish that transformed pig scraps into breakfast gold. Born in Pennsylvania Dutch country during the 1600s, Scrapple proved that true cuisine came from using every single part of the animal, no matter how unappetizing it might seem at first. When families butchered hogs, nothing was wasted, and Scrapple was a delicious proof that scraps could be transformed into something genuinely sought after, not just tolerated. The process was part preservation, part culinary art that turned what others might throw away into something special. You'd simmer pork scraps, organs like liver and heart, and bones in water until every bit of meat fell apart and the bones were clean. Then you'd remove the bones and chop the remaining meat finely, almost to a paste. The cooking liquid was strained to remove any debris and returned to the pot with the chopped meat. Then came the crucial part, slowly whisking in cornmeal and spices while stirring constantly to prevent lumps from forming. This took muscle and patience because the mixture got thick and heavy. You'd cook it until it was thick as mush, almost like wet cement, then pour into loaf pans to set overnight. The next morning, you'd slice it into thick pieces and fry them until golden and crispy on the outside while the inside stayed creamy and soft. This wasn't poverty food that people ate with shame. It was resourceful cooking that created something genuinely delicious. Pennsylvania families served scrapple with pride alongside eggs and pancakes for hearty breakfast that could fuel all-day farm work. The outside got crispy like a hash brown, while the inside stayed rich and flavorful with all those pork bits and cornmeal. Modern breakfast meats like sausage and bacon can't match scrapple's complex flavor and satisfying texture that turned waste into one of America's most beloved regional specialties. Some people still seek it out today, remembering grandparents who made it and refusing to let the tradition die. These 25 dinners fed families through hard times and carried traditions that stretched back generations. Most of them have disappeared from tables now, replaced by easier options and different tastes. But the memories remain for those who grew up with them. Which of these dishes do you remember eating? Drop a comment and let us know. And subscribe so these old recipes don't disappear completely from memory.